Red Fork wasn't a town so much as a scar on the face of the desert. A handful of sun-bleached buildings, a church with more dust than faith inside, and a main street that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a gunfight. It was the kind of place you went to forget who you were, or to make sure no one else remembered. And for 5 years, that's exactly what Jim Calder had been doing. Inside the Silver Star Saloon, the light was low and yellow, painting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was heavy, thick with the ghosts of spilled whiskey and cheap cigars. Behind the long oak bar, Jim moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a white rag in his hand, circling a glass that was already clean. His sleeves were rolled up, showing forearms thick with the kind of muscle that doesn't come from lifting bottles. A faded brown waistcoat, suspenders, scuffed boots. He was a picture of a simple man living a simple life. But everything about him was a lie. The way his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the room without turning his head. The way he stood, perfectly balanced, ready to shift his weight in an instant. The way his hands, now so gentle with the glass, looked like they were made to hold something heavier, something colder. 5 years he'd spent behind that bar. 5 years of burying the man he used to be under layers of quiet routine. Then the doors swung open, groaning on their hinges, and the past walked in. There were 5 of them, framed in the doorway like grim reapers on holiday. Their spurs chimed a death knell on the floorboards as they fanned out, their eyes drinking in the dim light of the saloon. They were the kind of men who smelled of gunpowder and bad intentions. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, swaggered up to the bar. He had a mean little grin plastered on his face, like he'd practiced it in a mirror. He slapped a silver dollar on the counter, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "Whiskey," he crowed, "and leave the bottle." Jim set the freshly polished glass down. He reached for a bottle of cheap rye, poured a single shot, and slid the glass toward the kid. Then, just as calmly, he put the bottle back on the shelf. The kid's grin faltered. His fingers tapped an impatient rhythm on the bar. "I said leave the damn bottle." Jim picked up his rag again, his voice flat, empty of emotion. "And I ain't deaf, son." The air in the saloon thickened, growing heavy and hard to breathe. The kid wasn't used to being told no. You could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his hand drifted down, casual-like, to rest near the butt of his pistol. Behind him, his 4 companions watched, silent and still. They were waiting for the show to start. Jim didn't even look at them. He didn't have to. He knew the type. Men who thought being fast with a gun made them strong. The kid's fingers twitched, ready to make the dumbest and last mistake of his young life. But Jim didn't reach for a gun. He didn't have one. Not anymore. Instead, his hand shot out, not toward the kid, but toward a heavy, unopened bottle of whiskey on the back shelf. He didn't just pick it up. He snatched it. And in one fluid motion, he slammed it down on the bar, right in front of the kid's face. The sound was like a gunshot, a deafening crack of glass on wood that made every man in the room jump. The kid flinched back, his eyes wide. Jim leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "Son," he said, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. "The only thing quicker than your draw is how fast I can put you in the ground. And I don't even need a bullet to do it." For a long second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The kid stared at Jim, his bravado draining away, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He was looking at a simple bartender, but he was seeing something else entirely. Something ancient and dangerous. His hand fell away from his gun. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the dead quiet. Then he turned, and without another word, he and his 4 friends walked back out of the saloon, their spurs suddenly silent. Jim watched them go. Then he picked up the bottle, placed it gently back on the shelf, and went back to polishing his glasses. The rhythm was the same. The movement was the same. But something had been broken. Something had been woken up. And across the room, Clara Morgan, the woman who owned the Silver Star, watched him with narrowed eyes. She'd known Jim for 5 years, and for the first time she realized she didn't know him at all. The wind was a restless thing that night, scratching at the windows of the saloon like a hungry animal. Red Fork was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Folks were whispering a name, Edgar Calloway, a name that tasted like blood and ash. They said he was a butcher, a man who burned down towns for fun and left sheriffs hanging from their own flagpoles. And they said he was coming. Inside the Silver Star, the few remaining patrons nursed their drinks, their eyes darting toward the door with every gust of wind. Jim Calder kept his hands busy, stacking bottles, wiping down the bar, anything to keep from thinking. 5 years of peace, 5 years of silence. It felt like a lifetime ago. Clara Morgan came and stood beside him, her arms crossed over her chest. She was a tough woman, born and raised in this hard country, but there was a worry in her eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. "You ever think about just leaving, Jim?" she asked, her voice low. Jim didn't look up. "Where would I go, Miss Morgan?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's the thing, isn't it? I've seen men come through here running from the law, running from a bad debt, running from a woman. But you're not running. You're hiding." Before Jim could answer, the saloon doors creaked open, and Marshal Robert Langley stepped inside. He was a good man, steady and fair, but tonight the lines on his face were carved a little deeper. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. He walked straight to the bar, his boots leaving dusty footprints on the floor. "Jim, Clara," he said, his voice grim. "We got a problem." Jim finally stopped wiping the bar. He placed the rag down, his movements slow and deliberate. "That so, Marshal?" Langley nodded, taking off his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "It's Edgar Calloway. His gang. They're coming." The name hung in the air like a shroud. Over in the corner, Dr. Elias Finch, a man who'd seen more bullet holes than most soldiers, quietly closed the medical journal he'd been pretending to read. He'd known from the day Jim Calder walked into town that the man was a walking powder keg. He'd just been praying he'd never have to see the fuse get lit. "How bad is it?" Clara asked, her voice tight. Langley's face was grim. "They hit Cedar Ridge last week. It wasn't a robbery, Clara. It was a massacre. They strung up the sheriff, killed his deputies while they made the whole town watch." A cold silence fell over the room. Cedar Ridge was only 2 days' ride away. "You're sure it's Calloway?" Finch asked from his corner table. "Got a wire from a scout," Langley said, his eyes finding Jim's. 5 men riding with him. Clay Sutter, the Boyer twins, and a kid named Luke Braddock. That last name made Jim's jaw tighten just for a second, a flicker of something in his eyes. "Braddock's just a boy," Jim said, his voice a low rumble. Langley sighed, a weary, defeated sound. "Maybe. But he's a boy with 2 notches on his belt and a hunger to prove himself. The most dangerous kind." "So what's the plan, Marshal?" Finch asked, getting to his feet. "Send for deputies from Carson City." "Takes 3 days for help to get here," Langley said, his gaze locked on Jim. "The scout said Calloway's less than a day out. He'll be here by morning." The marshal let that sink in. "We don't have 3 days." No one argued. The truth was a cold, hard thing sitting in the middle of the room. They were alone, outgunned and outmanned. Langley put his hat back on. He looked at Jim, a silent question in his eyes. A plea. Jim just stood there, his face a mask of stone. But Clara saw it, a subtle shift in his posture. The bartender's vest he wore suddenly seemed too small, too constricting. And for the first time since she'd met him, Jim Calder looked like a man who was forgetting how to be peaceful. Langley gave a short, sharp nod, as if an answer had been given. He turned and walked to the doors, pushing them open and stepping out into the wind-whipped street. He stood there on the porch, a lone figure staring out at the dark horizon. He was waiting for the devil to arrive. And inside the saloon, Jim Calder finally accepted a terrible truth. He had run out of places to hide. The sun was a blood-red smear on the horizon when they appeared. 5 riders, silhouetted against the dying light. They didn't ride fast. They moved with a slow, arrogant certainty, like kings coming to survey a kingdom they already owned. Dust plumed up from their horses' hooves, a pale, ghostly banner announcing their arrival. From the window of the Silver Star, Clara watched, her knuckles white where she gripped the windowsill. Jim stood behind the bar, not moving, not speaking. But he was no longer a bartender. That man was gone. In his place was something else, something harder and colder. He had unbuttoned his waistcoat, and the simple change made him look like a different person, a more dangerous person. The riders came to a stop in the middle of the street. The man in the center was Edgar Calloway. He was a big man, draped in a long black duster. A dirty red bandana was tied around his neck. His face was hidden in the shadow of his hat, but you could see the cruel curl of his lips. He looked at the town of Red Fork, at the shuttered windows and empty streets, and he smiled. Marshal Langley stepped out from his office, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He walked into the middle of the street to face them. "There's no trouble for you here, Calloway," Langley called out, his voice steady. Calloway let out a low chuckle. "No trouble, Marshal? Why, that hurts my feelings. We rode all this way just to have a friendly drink." "We don't serve your kind of friendly in Red Fork," Langley said, his feet planted firm. Calloway's smile vanished. "That's a shame, a real shame." His eyes flicked to the men beside him, to Clay Sutter, whose eyes were like chips of ice, to the Boyer twins, who grinned with too many teeth, to the young one, Luke Braddock, whose hand was already flexing, itching for a fight. "Now, Marshal," Calloway said, his voice dropping to a silky, menacing tone, "I'm going to give you a choice. You can step aside and let us enjoy your town's hospitality, or—" He let the word hang in the air. Langley's hand tightened on his gun. "Not going to happen, Edgar." It happened so fast, it was like a trick of the light. Calloway's hand was a blur. The roar of his pistol echoed off the silent buildings. Marshal Langley staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face. A dark red flower bloomed on his chest. He collapsed into the dust, his gun unfired. Inside the saloon, Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dr. Finch shot to his feet, his chair clattering to the floor. Jim's hands clenched into fists on the bar, the wood groaning under the pressure. Calloway blew the smoke from the barrel of his gun, looking down at the dead marshal with complete indifference. "Shame," he said again. "He should have stepped aside." Then he swung down from his horse, his spurs clicking on the hard-packed earth, and started walking toward the Silver Star Saloon. His men followed, their faces alight with cruel anticipation. The saloon doors swung open, and for the second time in as many days, Edgar Calloway filled the frame. He took his time, his eyes sweeping over the few terrified patrons, over Clara, over Dr. Finch. Then his gaze landed on the man behind the bar. He strolled forward, tossing a few bloody coins onto the counter. They clattered and spun, coming to rest next to the dark stain where the marshal's life had pooled. "Whiskey," Calloway sneered, "and leave the bottle." It was a repeat of the day before, the same words, the same demand, but this was not the same bartender. Jim reached for the bottle, his movements still calm, still measured. He poured a single drink and slid it across the bar. Then, just like before, he put the bottle back. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "Are you deaf, old man? I said leave it." Jim's voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet. Bottle's $8. You're short. One of the Boyer twins let out a snicker, but Calloway wasn't laughing. He leaned forward, his face just inches from Jim's. His breath smelled of rot. You got a name, bartender? Jim met his gaze without flinching. His fingers were resting lightly on the bar top. Jim, just... Jim? Calloway's lips curled into a snarl. I don't like liars. He jerked his head toward Clay Sutter. Clay, teach just Jim here some manners. Remind him who's in charge now. Sutter cracked his knuckles, a wide, ugly grin splitting his face. He stepped toward the bar. Jim didn't move. He didn't even seem to be breathing. He just stood there, waiting. You hear him, old man? Sutter growled, getting closer. Time for your lesson. Then it happened. Not fast, not flashy. It was brutally efficient. As Sutter reached for him, Jim's hand shot out like a striking snake. He didn't grab Sutter's arm. He grabbed his wrist, his fingers finding the precise point where the bones were weakest. There was a sharp, sickening pop. Sutter screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. His knees buckled, and Jim, still holding his wrist, used his momentum to slam Sutter's face down onto the oak bar. There was a wet, crunching sound. The room went completely silent, except for Sutter's choked moans as he slid to the floor, a broken, bloody mess. Calloway stared, his sneer gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The Boyer twins froze, their hands hovering over their guns. Luke Braddock, the kid, went pale, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Jim let go of Sutter's wrist. He picked up his white rag, wiped the spot of blood from the bar, and then turned his cold, empty eyes on Edgar Calloway. Anyone else want a lesson? He asked. The saloon was a tinderbox, and Jim Calder had just struck the match. Edgar Calloway stared at the broken form of Clay Sutter, then back at the bartender. The easy confidence was gone from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He was a predator who had just discovered his prey had teeth, sharp ones. You just made a big mistake, friend, Calloway hissed, his hand dropping to rest on the handle of his Colt. The younger one, Luke Braddock, looked nervously between his boss and the bartender. Boss, he whispered, his voice trembling, maybe we should just go. Calloway's eyes didn't leave Jim. You take one step toward that door, boy, he said without turning his head, and I'll kill you myself. Braddock froze, trapped. Jim shifted his weight, a tiny movement settling onto the balls of his feet. He was a statue, but a statue poised to spring. It was a gunslinger's stance, and Calloway recognized it. A flicker of something, maybe recognition, maybe just confusion, crossed his face. There's 4 of us left, Calloway said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. You can't take us all. You might get one of us, but the others will put you down before your body hits the floor. Jim gave a slow, deliberate nod. That's probably true. And then he did something that made no sense. He reached down behind the bar. Calloway's grin widened. That's it. Reach for it. Let's see what you got. Jim's hand came back up, but he wasn't holding a pistol. He was holding a sawed-off shotgun. He placed it on the bar with a heavy thud, the twin barrels pointing at the ceiling. The outlaws tensed, their hands gripping their weapons. What the hell do you think you're doing? Calloway demanded, his voice tight. Jim finally looked him straight in the eye. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it was a cold, terrifying thing. Telling you, he said softly. I don't need it. And then all hell broke loose. Before anyone could process his words, Jim's other hand, the one holding the whiskey glass, whipped forward. The glass flew through the air like a cannonball and shattered against Luke Braddock's face. The kid screamed, stumbling backward, his hands flying to his ruined, bloody nose. A gunshot exploded, deafening in the enclosed space. But it was wild. Braddock, blinded by pain and blood, had fired blindly, the bullet tearing a chunk out of the ceiling. In that split second of distraction, Jim moved. He wasn't a bartender anymore. He was lightning. He grabbed the shotgun off the bar, but not to fire it. He swung it like a club. The heavy stock connected with one of the Boyer twins' jaw with a sickening crunch. The man went down like a sack of bricks. The other Boyer managed to draw his pistol, firing a shot that splintered the whiskey barrel right next to Jim's head. Before he could fire again, Jim had reversed his grip on the shotgun. The steel barrels smashed into the outlaw's temple. He collapsed without a sound. 3 down in less than 3 seconds. And then there was one. Edgar Calloway stood there, his gun halfway out of its holster, his face a mask of pure shock. His gang, his tough, feared gang, was lying broken and bleeding on the floor around him. His confidence, his entire world, had been shattered. But a cornered rat is the most dangerous kind. With a roar of rage, Calloway ripped his pistol free. He was fast, very fast, but Jim was faster. He dropped the shotgun and, in a single fluid motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics, he drew a pistol. It wasn't there a second ago. A long-barreled Colt Peacemaker that seemed to have appeared from nowhere, plucked from a holster hidden beneath his apron. The roar of Jim's Colt was the last sound Edgar Calloway heard clearly. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. His own gun fired, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the floorboards. He staggered, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and utter disbelief. The saloon was suddenly quiet again, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Jim stepped out from behind the bar, the smoking pistol held loosely at his side. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he was standing right in front of Calloway. The outlaw leader gritted his teeth, blood seeping through his fingers. "Who? Who the hell are you?" he gasped. Jim looked down at him, and for the first time, he let the mask slip completely. He let Calloway see the man he had been hiding for 5 long years, the ghost. "The name," Jim said, his voice a low, cold whisper that promised death, "is not Jim." He raised the pistol, leveling it between Calloway's eyes. "And you've been hunting the wrong man." Just as his finger tightened on the trigger, the saloon doors swung open again. Dr. Finch stood there, his medical bag in his hand. His eyes took in the carnage, the bodies on the floor, the blood, and the man holding the gun. "Don't do it, Jim," Finch said, his voice calm but firm. "You kill him like this in cold blood and you become him. You throw away everything you've worked for." Jim didn't lower the gun. Calloway stared up the barrel, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. He finally understood. He finally recognized the eyes staring down at him. Eyes he'd only heard about in stories, told in hushed whispers around campfires. "Please," Calloway whimpered, the last of his pride gone. "Phantom Rider." Jim's finger remained on the trigger. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Clara watched from the corner, her heart pounding in her chest, praying he would make the right choice. Finally, with a long, slow exhale, Jim lowered the pistol. He looked at Finch. "Get him out of my saloon." Then he turned and walked back behind the bar, the gun disappearing as mysteriously as it had appeared. He picked up a clean glass and his white rag and began to polish, but his hands were shaking. The night bled into a gray, somber dawn. Red Fork had survived, but it was wounded. The bodies of the Boyer twins had been dragged out, and Dr. Finch was busy patching up the others in the town's small makeshift jail. Calloway, delirious with pain from his shoulder wound and a raging fever, kept muttering a name over and over. "The Phantom Rider. He's real." Outside the saloon, Jim Calder sat on the top step of the porch, watching the sun come up. The shotgun lay across his lap. He hadn't slept. He hadn't even moved. He just sat there, a sentinel guarding a town that was no longer his sanctuary. Clara came out and stood beside him, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to him. Their fingers brushed, and she felt a tremor run through his hand. "So," she said softly, breaking the long silence. The Phantom Rider. Jim didn't look at her. He just stared out at the dusty street, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. It was a long time ago. Not long enough, apparently, she said. She took a sip of her coffee. 5 years, Jim. You've been here 5 years. You never said a word. Nothing to say, he mumbled. That man is dead. Clara let out a small, sad laugh. He didn't look very dead last night. They sat in silence for another minute, the only sound the wind whispering through the town. Dr. Finch emerged from the jail, wiping his bloody hands on a rag. He walked over to them, his face grim. Calloway's got a fever, but he'll live, he said. He looked down at Jim. He won't be the last one, you know. Now that the story is out, they'll come looking. Every punk with a fast gun and something to prove will ride into this town looking for the man who took down Edgar Calloway, looking for the Phantom Rider. Jim finally looked up, his eyes meeting Finch's. I know. So what are you going to do? Finch asked. Jim was quiet for a long time. He looked at the saloon, at the town he had tried to call home. He looked at Clara, at the worry and the strength in her face. He had come here to bury his past, but all he'd managed to do was plant it in the middle of her town, and now a bloody harvest was coming. He stood up, setting the coffee mug down. He slung the shotgun over his shoulder. You're leaving, Clara said. It wasn't a question. Jim nodded slowly. Calloway didn't find me by accident, Clara. He was hunting me. Someone told him where I was, and if they told him, they'll tell others. He adjusted the hat on his head, pulling the brim low. I can't bring that kind of trouble here. I can't let this town pay for my sins. He gave her a long, final look, a look that said all the things he could never say out loud. Then he turned and started walking. He didn't have a horse, didn't have a destination. He was just a man walking away from the only peace he'd ever known. Clara and Finch watched him go, a solitary figure walking into the rising sun, his shadow stretching long and lonely behind him. Damn fool, Clara whispered, a tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. But as Jim reached the edge of town, something made him stop. A sound, the jingle of a harness. He turned. An old farmer, a man named Silas who Jim had served drinks to for 5 years, was standing there holding the reins of a horse. It wasn't much of a horse, but it was sturdy. Figured you might need this, Silas said, his voice gruff. Then another man appeared, holding out a saddlebag. There's food in here. Water. Then another. And another. The people of Red Fork, the quiet, fearful people who had hidden behind their locked doors, were stepping out into the morning light. They weren't offering him judgment. They weren't offering him fear. They were offering him help. Doctor. Finch walked up and pressed a small leather pouch into Jim's hand. For medicine. And bullets. Jim looked around, at the faces of the townspeople, at Clara, who was now smiling through her tears. He had tried so hard to be invisible, to be no one. But he had become one of them anyway. He had found a home, and now he had to leave it to protect it. He took the reins from Silas, his throat too tight to speak. He swung himself up into the saddle. He looked down at them all one last time. Thank you, he said, the words rough. Then he turned the horse and rode away, not into the sunrise, but into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness. He was no longer Jim Calder, the bartender. He was the Phantom Rider again. And he was going hunting. The desert was a furnace, a vast, empty expanse that baked the life out of everything. For 3 days, Jim rode, the sun beating down on him, the silence a constant companion. He wasn't just running. He was thinking. Calloway had found him. That wasn't luck. It was information. Someone had sold him out. His past was a long, bloody ledger, and he started going through the names one by one. Men he'd wronged, men he'd spared, men whose brothers or fathers he'd put in the ground. The list was long. On the fourth day, he found what he was looking for, a small, fly-bitten town called Jericho Wells. It was a miserable place, little more than a stagecoach stop and a den of thieves. If you wanted to find a man who trafficked in secrets, this was the place. He left his horse at the edge of town and walked in, the shotgun held loosely in his hand. He wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. The time for hiding was over. He walked into the only saloon, a grimy place called the Scorpion's Kiss. The dozen or so men inside stopped talking and turned to look at him. They were hard men, their faces scarred and their eyes wary. Jim walked straight to the bar. The bartender was a large, sweaty man with a greasy apron and shifty eyes. "I'm looking for a man," Jim said, his voice low and raspy from the trail. "Calls himself the Weasel." The bartender licked his lips nervously. "Never heard of him." Jim smiled, a cold, thin smile that held no warmth. He reached into the leather pouch Finch had given him and pulled out a gold coin. He placed it on the bar. "Maybe this will help your memory." The bartender's eyes darted to the coin, then back to Jim's face. He saw the cold resolve there, the promise of violence. He swallowed hard. He sometimes drinks in the back room," the bartender stammered, nodding toward a grimy curtain. Jim left the coin on the bar and pushed through the curtain. The back room was small and filled with thick smoke. 3 men were playing poker at a round table. One of them was small and wiry, with a nervous twitch in his left eye. He looked up as Jim entered, and a flicker of recognition, followed by pure terror, flashed across his face. He tried to stand, knocking his chair over, his hand fumbling for his gun. He never had a chance. Jim was on him in 2 strides. He grabbed the man by the front of his shirt, slamming him back against the wall. The Weasel's pistol clattered to the floor. "Calloway!" Jim snarled, his face inches from the terrified informants. "You told him where to find me. Who paid you?" The Weasel was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. I don't know who he was. Just a man. In a suit. From the railroad." Jim's blood ran cold. The railroad. It wasn't just some old enemy. It was something bigger. Something organized. "What did he want?" Jim demanded, his grip tightening. "He wanted you!" the Weasel gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "He wanted the Phantom Rider. Said his boss, a man named Blackwood, had a score to settle. He said Blackwood was sending a team. Not just outlaws. Professionals. To finish the job Calloway started. A team. Professionals. A man named Blackwood." It was all starting to make a horrible kind of sense. The past wasn't just catching up to him. It was hunting him with a vengeance. And Red Fork was right in the crosshairs. Jim let go of the Weasel, who slumped to the floor, gasping for air. He had made a terrible mistake. By leaving Red Fork, he hadn't saved them. He had just left them undefended. He turned and strode out of the room, out of the saloon, his mind racing. He had to get back. He had to warn them. But as he stepped out into the blinding sunlight of Jericho Wells, he knew he was already too late. Standing in the middle of the street, blocking his path, were 4 men. They weren't dressed like outlaws. They wore dark, practical clothing, and they moved with a quiet, deadly efficiency. Each man held a rifle, not pointed at him, but held at the ready. They were soldiers, mercenaries. One of them, a tall man with a long, pale scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "The Phantom Rider," the man said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Mr. Blackwood sends his regards. He wants you to know that your town is already burning." The ride back to Red Fork was a frantic, desperate blur. Jim pushed his horse to its limit, his heart a cold, hard knot of dread in his chest. The words of the mercenary echoed in his mind. Your town is already burning. He had been so sure he was doing the right thing by leaving. He had tried to draw the fire away from them, to lead his ghosts out into the desert where they could harm no one else. But he had been arrogant. He had underestimated his enemy. This wasn't about some old grudge. This was a corporation. a railroad baron named Blackwood who operated with the cold, ruthless logic of money and power, and Red Fork was just a pawn in his game. As he crested the final ridge, his worst fears were realized. A thick column of black smoke rose into the sky, a funeral pyre for the town he had tried to save. He spurred his horse on, charging down the slope, the shotgun bouncing against his back. The smell of smoke and death filled the air. The town was a scene from hell. The livery stable was an inferno, the flames leaping high into the sky. The general store had been ransacked, its windows shattered, and in the middle of the street, 3 bodies lay under dusty blankets. Jim leaped from his horse before it had even stopped, his boots hitting the ground running. He recognized the shape under one of the blankets. The old farmer, Silas, the man who had given him a horse. A wave of fury and guilt so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him. "Jim!" He spun around. Dr. Finch was running toward him from the direction of the church, his face smudged with soot, a rifle in his hands. "Thank God," Finch gasped, his chest heaving. We thought you were gone for good." "What happened?" Jim demanded, his voice a low growl. "Where's Clara?" "They came about an hour after you left," Finch said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "Not like Calloway's bunch. These men were organized. They moved like an army. They said they were claiming the town for the railroad, that everyone had 1 hour to get out." He pointed toward the church. "When people resisted, they just started shooting. Silas was one of the first. We managed to get most of the women and children into the church. Clara's with them. We've been trying to hold them off." Jim's eyes scanned the remaining buildings. He could see them now. Men in dark clothing, positioned on rooftops, behind barricades, snipers, a professional siege. "How many?" Jim asked. "At least a dozen," Finch said grimly. "They're led by a man named Harmon, the one with the scar, the man from Jericho Wells. They hadn't followed him. They had split up. One team to delay him, the main force to hit the town. It was a classic pincer movement. Blackwood wasn't just a railroad man. He was a strategist. "They want me," Jim said, the pieces clicking into place. "This isn't about the town. It's about drawing me back. They're using the townspeople as bait." Finch nodded, his jaw tight. "It's working." Jim looked at the church, then at the mercenaries dug in around the town. They were trapped, outnumbered, but they weren't broken. He looked at Dr. Finch, a man of medicine, holding a rifle like he was born to it. He saw a flicker of the lawman he used to be. "Get back to the church, Doc," Jim said, his voice hard as iron. "Bar the doors. Don't let anyone in or out. Keep Clara and the others safe." "What are you going to do?" Finch asked, though he already knew the answer. Jim chambered around in the shotgun. The sound was a definitive, metallic promise. "I'm going to remind Mr. Blackwood why people started calling me a ghost." He handed his horse's reins to Finch. "And Doc, try not to get killed." Finch gave him a grim smile. "You too, Jim. You too." As the doctor ran back toward the church, Jim melted into the shadows of an alleyway. The hunter had become the hunted. Now it was time to turn the tables. Red Fork was his town now, and these men were trespassing. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows that turned the ravaged town into a maze of darkness and light. For the mercenaries, the fading light was a disadvantage. For a ghost, it was a cloak. Jim moved through the back alleys and collapsed buildings of Red Fork like a phantom, his movements silent, his presence unfelt until it was too late. He knew this town, every creaky floorboard, every loose shutter. It was his hunting ground. The first mercenary was on the roof of the blacksmith's shop, a sniper with a long rifle. He was watching the church, waiting for a target to appear. He never heard Jim come up the rickety ladder behind him. There was no gunshot, just the soft thud of a body hitting the rooftop, and then silence. Jim took the man's rifle and his ammunition. He moved to the next position, a pair of mercenaries holed up in the ransacked general store. They were drinking whiskey, laughing about the day's work. They thought the fight was over. Jim slipped in through a broken back window. The first man died with a knife in his back. The second turned, his eyes wide with surprise, just as the butt of the sniper rifle crashed into his skull. 2 more down. He was no longer a man. He was an act of vengeance, a force of nature. From the roof of the general store, he could see the layout of the remaining forces. Harmon, the man with the scar, had set up his command post in the Silver Star Saloon. Of course he had. It was a message. I have taken your home. There were 4 men with him inside, and 4 more positioned around the perimeter, boxing in the church. He was still outnumbered. He needed to even the odds. He used the sniper rifle. The first shot took out a man crouched behind a water trough. The second shattered the night, finding its mark on a mercenary hiding in the dark doorway of the assayer's office. The men were professionals, but they were used to fighting soldiers, not a ghost. They started firing wildly into the shadows, their discipline cracking. Panic was his greatest weapon. He slipped away from the rooftop, leaving the rifle behind. He circled around, using the chaos he had created as cover. He crawled under the raised boardwalk, the dust and grime coating his face until he was right below the saloon. He could hear them shouting inside, Harmon trying to restore order. He had one last trick up his sleeve. In the alley behind the saloon, he found what he was looking for, a barrel of kerosene from the saloon's storeroom. He worked quickly, quietly, rolling the barrel to the side of the building, tipping it over, letting the flammable liquid soak into the dry, sun-baked wood of the wall. He pulled a match from his pocket, struck it on his boot heel. The flame flared to life, a tiny orange star in the darkness. He looked at the flame, then at the saloon. He thought of Clara, of Finch, of Silas. He thought of the 5 years of peace he had tried to build and the men who had torn it all down. His face was a grim, emotionless mask. He tossed the match. The wall of the Silver Star erupted in a whoosh of fire. Flames climbed the dry wood with terrifying speed, smoke and ash billowing into the night sky. Inside, the shouting turned to screams of panic and fear. The front doors burst open and the mercenaries stumbled out, choking, their eyes streaming. They ran right into his line of fire. The shotgun roared once, twice, 2 men fell. He dropped the empty shotgun and drew his Colt, the one that had taken down Calloway. He fired 3 more times, the shots precise, economical. 3 more men went down. And then it was quiet. The saloon burned, the fire casting a hellish, dancing light over the street. From the inferno, a single figure emerged, silhouetted against the flames. Harmon. He was burned, his clothes smoldering, but he was alive, and he was holding a pistol. He saw Jim standing there in the middle of the street, and a hateful, pained grin split his scarred face. "So you're the ghost," Harmon rasped, raising his pistol. Jim raised his own Colt, the barrel steady, his aim true. "Ghosts don't bleed," Jim said, and he fired. The fire in the saloon raged, a beacon in the night, but it was a fire of cleansing now. The battle for Red Fork was over. The church doors creaked open and the townspeople, led by Clara and Dr. Finch, slowly emerged, their faces a mixture of fear, shock, and dawning relief. They saw the bodies of the mercenaries littering the street. They saw the burning saloon, and they saw the solitary figure standing in the middle of it all, smoke curling from the barrel of his gun. Clara ran to him, not caring about the danger, the bodies, the blood. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. He stood stiffly for a moment, surprised by the contact, then his arms slowly came up and held her. "It's over, Jim," she whispered into his shirt. "It's over." He held her for a long moment, then gently pushed her back. "No," he said, his voice heavy. "It's just beginning." He looked at Finch, who was already tending to Harmon's body, confirming the kill. "Blackwood sent them. A railroad man. He won't stop. He'll just send more men. Better men." A look of grim understanding passed between them. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Jim had stopped being a bartender to save this town, but now the Phantom Rider had to stay to keep it safe. As the sun began to rise, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of pink and orange, the people of Red Fork gathered around him. They weren't looking at him with fear anymore. They were looking at him with hope. He was no longer a stranger hiding from his past. He was their protector, their ghost. He looked out at the horizon toward the east, where the railroad and a man named Blackwood were waiting. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't wait for the war to come to him. He had to take the war to them. Some men run from their past, and some men are buried by it. But every once in a while, a man turns around and faces it, with a gun in his hand and fire in his eyes. The story of Jim Calder, the bartender, was over, written in blood and ash. But the legend of the Phantom Rider was just getting started. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more legends brought to life, do me a favor. Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe.